Oh, and this, yeah, I'm a bit paranoid about wind after my last video, so I'm going a bit OTT with the wind muffs. Better safe than sorry. No, I've not gone mad. I've just been sat inside for 3 days editing, so I really wanted to be outside. Welcome to my 21st video. Now, in the past 20 videos, I've learnt that people seem to enjoy the sort of semi-advanced stuff when I'm talking about luminosity masks and dynamic range and equivalents and that kind of thing. Well, today I'm going to scrap all those learnings and just make a video for complete beginners. Why? Let me explain. Stop being windy! So a couple of weeks back, Emily and I went to Manchester to check out our new home city. Well, it will be in a couple of months. And on the way back...
So if I want there to be less stuff in focus, yeah, I need the F number to be...
small. Now that's not particularly uncommon. I mean, the next day...
So what do my ISO settings need to be?
Clearly I've not done a particularly good job of teaching Emily how to use manual mode, so I thought I'd do a reference video that's mainly for Emily, but if anyone else learns anything then that's great as well. But before I start, I'll let you into a bit of a secret. Nobody really uses manual mode. 95% of the photographers I know only really use aperture priority mode, and I know probably 10 photographers, so that's 9.5 of them. The reason for that is that manual mode can be a bit of a faff, but the thing is, if you learn how to use manual mode, then you know how to use all the modes. So that's the reason for this this video. By the way, I have no idea how to set up a flat lay. This is just a best guess. This was a terrible idea. Now you can't see me. No, I don't think this flat lay thing's gonna work. I was gonna write down all the... I brought a Sharpie and everything. Do one. This was a terrible idea. Hay fever. Why am I up on a mountain explaining this? Okay, manual mode. Maybe I should go back inside. If I take a picture. Okay, just 24 hours, 300 sneezes and 2 tablets later, I'm all better again. The power of the human body. I mean, I'm indoors and all the windows in the house are locked. So I think the best way to start explaining manual mode is to start in auto mode. So if I take some pictures in auto, sorry, I'm still 3 years old inside, but when I take those photos, there are a couple of things happening before you hear the shutter sound. The camera's focusing, and it's also working out how much light it has access to, and then playing around with the settings to give a good exposure for that amount of light. And when I say playing around with settings, I mean 3 settings in particular, and they're the same 3 settings that you control when you shoot in manual mode. And they are shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. We'll start with the easiest, shutter speed. So shutter speed is just the amount of time that the shutter is open for, and therefore exposing the sensor to light. That stands to reason that the longer the shutter is open, the more light hits the sensor, the brighter the image will be. So when you're indoors or you're shooting at night, you need the shutter to be open for longer than when you're outside on a nice bright pollen-laden day to collect the same amount of light and give you a nice bright exposure. Now shutter speeds usually run from a few thousandths of a second, 4,000th or an 8,000th, or if you've got an electronic shutter, 16,000, 32, really short amount of time, to minutes on the other end of the spectrum, or as long as the battery lasts in some modes. But shutter speed can often be used creatively too. So if, for example, you want to introduce the feeling of speed in an image, you might want to blur your subject that's moving past. And to do that, you can use a slower shutter speed. If you want to freeze the action and get rid of any chance of motion, then you'd increase the shutter speed to stop whatever it was in its tracks. Yeah, so that's shutter speed. Very simple. Next up is aperture. Aperture is a little bit more complicated, but all it really is a hole through the lens. Now, in most lenses, you can increase or decrease the size of that hole to let in more or less light. Now, aperture is measured in f numbers. And confusingly, the wider the aperture you give the lens, the smaller the f number. Don't know why that is. But if you've shot for a lens in the past, you might have seen that an f number usually makes its way into the name of the lens or high up on the description of the lens. And And that number typically represents the widest possible aperture that that lens can achieve. And that number is important for a few reasons. The wider the aperture, the more light a lens can let in, and therefore the quicker the shutter speed can be, meaning it's more useful in low light situations, for example. But also, a wider aperture allows you to have a shallower depth of field. And in photography, quite often a shallow depth of field is, maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, associated more with good images. And in fairness, it is a great way to highlight your subject more, only having a subject in focus and everything else being out of focus. This big heffalump of a lens can get to f2.8, which is pretty wide, but some lenses you'll see can be f1.2, sometimes even under f1, which is really wide open and would give you a razor thin depth of field. Not particularly of interest to me, but looks quite arty. And finally, setting number 3 is called ISO. ISO is basically the sensor's sensitivity to light. Now, generally, if you're shooting in good light, you probably just want to leave ISO alone. Leave it in its lowest setting, which is usually ISO 1 or 200, and just don't touch it. But if you're shooting in low light and you can't get a sharp image because your shutter speed has to be open for so long to let so much light in that your hand is shaking or you can't keep the camera steady even with the aperture wide open, then you need to start playing around with ISO. So the higher you raise the ISO number, the more sensitive to light the sensor becomes, which means you can have a faster shutter speed and you can have a smaller aperture. Now in principle that sounds great. You think why wouldn't you just always raise the ISO if it means you can have faster shutter speeds and not have to worry about camera shake? There is a big drawback with ISO, and that drawback is called noise. So you can raise the sensitivity, but if you do, the noise will start to ruin the image. It'll start to look grainy and soft and a bit flat and generally not very nice. So ISO can be useful. Different cameras cope with it differently. Some cameras are really incredible at still shooting really nice clean images when the ISO is raised quite a lot. Other cameras aren't so good. Speaking very generally, a big sensor is usually better at coping with higher ISO numbers than a small sensor. So they're the 3 settings you have access to in manual mode. Now those 3 things together form what we call the exposure triangle, and they're put together in a triangle because they all affect each other. For example, if you speed up the shutter speed, therefore reducing the amount of light that can get through to the sensor because the shutter is open for a smaller amount of time, then you need to widen up the aperture or increase the ISO to get the same exposure. And that's the same for all of them. If you decrease the size of the aperture, then you'll need to have the shutter speed open for longer to let the same amount of light in and get the same exposure. Now you might be thinking, well, that sounds like a right faff, I'm never going to shoot in manual mode. The other thing you might be thinking is, well, how do you know you've got the correct exposure using manual mode without just taking loads of different photos? That sounds really awful. The good thing about manual mode is that even when you tell the camera that you want no help and you're going to set all the settings yourself, the camera will still let you know what it thinks of your settings. Let me explain. So here we're set up with another photo of the bonsai tree, which has made lots of appearances in previous videos, and you might just be able to see that I'm at f22, I'm at 125th of a second, and ISO 100. Now the camera is giving me an exposure reading, and that exposure reading is really helpful. As you can see, here is 0 and it goes all the way into the minuses. If I reduce the shutter speed to 1/8 of a second, it's now suggesting that that is the right exposure. You can see there's a little mark on 0, which means the camera now thinks that it has the right exposure. Oh no, it now thinks it's slightly overexposed. Why does it keep changing? That's annoying for the purpose of this video. Okay, it's now 1/13 of a second. I think it's because the sun keeps going in and out. But as you can see now, oh, you joker. So yeah, I'm having to keep making changes because the light outside is changing because the sun keeps coming in and out of the cloud. But as you can see now, we're at a 20th of a second and the camera thinks it's correctly exposed. So if I take a shot, yeah, that looks broadly like the right exposure to me. Now what I did to get that exposure roughly right, as you saw, was I just reduced the shutter speed by a lot. Now I can do that because in this situation, I'm on a tripod. If I wasn't on a tripod and I was having to hand hold, then I'd probably decide to take down the aperture rather than the shutter speed to a 20th of a second, because otherwise I'm just going to get a really shaky shot. There are a couple of other reasons I wouldn't want to be at f20, and really anything higher than sort of f13 you get what's called diffraction, which you don't really need to know about, but let's just say that lenses rarely perform optimally past sort of f13. So instead of taking the shutter speed right down to a 20th of a second, we can take the aperture down to say, let's say f8. And as you can see now, the exposure is way above 0, which means that I can increase my shutter speed again. So we've now got 125th of a second, which would be fine even if we were hand holding. But let's say that this bonsai tree isn't indoors and it's super windy outside, and even though we want to be at f8, we know that we're going to need a shutter speed way above 125th of a second, because if we only shoot at 125th of a second, we're going to pick up a lot of movement. So to do that, we're going to need to raise the ISO. So let's go to ISO 1600, and as you can see, the exposure is shot way up again because we don't need that much sensitivity with this aperture and shutter setting based on the light that the camera thinks is around. What that enables us to do is to move the shutter speed all the way up again, and if we want to go to 0, then the camera now recommends that we can get a good exposure with a shutter speed of a 2,000th of a second, which should take care of any wind movement. Now the only other thing that's worth talking about at this point is how the camera is coming to the conclusion of how much light is needed for a correct exposure. So there are typically 3 or 4 different ways a camera can meter for light. This button here on this particular camera is the button to change the light metering. So if I press it, you'll see that all readings on the screen go away apart from this little icon here. Now that icon determines that currently we're set to multi-metering, which means the camera is looking at everything that's currently in the picture and trying to determine the correct exposure for everything that's in the picture. But I can change it to center-weighted metering, which means the camera will now give its exposure recommendation based mostly off what's in the center of the frame, or spot metering, which means it'll only look at one spot in the middle of the frame and make a determination just from that place. But for most things you can leave it in multi-metering and it'll do a pretty good job. Now I said yesterday, before going into a mad sneezing fit, that most people don't really use manual mode all that often. It's a pain having to adjust all 3 settings every time you want to get a shot. The truth is that most of the time you don't really have a preference on all 3 settings, you might only have a preference on one setting, and that's where the semi-automatic modes come in handy. Now as you can see on this dial, we're currently set up on manual mode, but if I change that to aperture mode, what that means is that I can now select the aperture and the camera will then work out the right shutter speed and the right ISO. I don't have to worry about their settings, all I have to worry about is the aperture that I want. And the same thing goes for shutter priority mode. So if I flick it into shutter priority mode, I can now choose the shutter speed and the camera will work out the correct aperture and the correct ISO setting. Aperture priority and shutter priority I think are used so much more than manual mode. And program mode in many ways is just an ISO priority mode. So you set the ISO and the camera will work out the shutter speed and the aperture. Now when you're using the semi-automatic modes, you might find that a lot of the time you don't agree with the exposure that the camera gives you. You might think it's too bright or too dark, and when that's the case, all you have to do is adjust the exposure. So luckily my camera has an exposure adjustment button, and I can turn that down or turn it up depending on whether I think my image is too bright or too dark. And if I'm, say, in aperture mode, then all that will do is adjust the shutter speed and ISO to make sure that I'm getting an exposure I'm comfortable with. Get it?